Okay, hello and welcome dear participants and distinguished guest speakers of the 7 sessions of our guest lecture series, or what we know as KURING, Kuliah Daring. This program is a collaboration between Master's Program in Landscape Architecture ITB, Indonesia Society of Landscape Architect or IALI, Indonesian Education Forum, or Landscape Architecture or FPALI, and of course the University of Melbourne. My name is Asep Darmana. Today I will be your moderators for today's sessions. Today we are very excited to have our guest speaker, Dr. Gillian Wallis, and our panelist, Ibu Astrid Haryati. Thank you for making time to be with us today. I see here Pak Bian Heri, the President of Indonesia Society of Landscape Architects, here with us as well. Okay, yeah. Before we begin, allow me to read the house rule of this session. Oh, okay, the agenda and the house rule. The agenda of this session is the opening remarks from our chairs of master's program, Pak Budi, and then the main session will be the lectures by Dr. Gillian Wallis, and then will be followed by discussion, questions and answer from our panelists and participants, and will be conclude and follow with the interactive sessions to cool down the discussion. And we will close this session today with a group photo. Now we are moving to house rules. Okay, house rule for the participants. Participants are required to use actual name as their username. Participants to keep their microphone turned off during the main sessions. So you have any questions, you may use the chat box during the sessions, and questions and discussions will be entertained after the lectures. Please ensure to check the chat box if any similar questions has been posted to avoid repeated questions. Please use the chat box only for substantive and relevant matters to the sessions. And the organizer has the right to remove any participants should they not comply to the rules. Okay. Moving on is the opening remarks from our chairs of Master Program in Landscape Architecture, Pak Budi Faisal. Pak Budi, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Pak Asep. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. As we know that Melbourne School of Design from University of Melbourne and School of Architecture, Planning and Policy Development, ITB, has a very long cohesion connection. We have done many mutual works in the last 10 years. Such as joint program, summer program, collaborative design studio, exchange students, as well as exchange faculty. And today, in this guest lecture, I'm very grateful that we will have two prominent people, Professor Gillian Wallis from Melbourne School of Design, University of Melbourne, as a speaker, and Ibu Astrid Haryati, one of our advisory board in the program that acts as a panelist. I think without any further ado, I would like to give back to Pak Asep so we can listen to a very, I think, fruitful lecture and discussion from Professor Gillian Wallis and Ibu Astrid Haryati. Of course, they are, I think, very happy to entertain some questions from all of us. Thank you again. Thank you so much, Professor Gillian Wallis and Ibu Astrid Haryati. We get back to you, Pak Asep. Thank you. Still mute, Pak Asep? Still mute?
Sorry. Okay, my apologize. Okay, before we moving on to the main agenda, allow me to remind you that the participant is required to fill in an online form that will be circulated through the chat box. The attendee list will be used for the e-certificate purposes. Okay, next I'd like to introduce our guest speaker and panelists for today's session. I will be reading a brief bio of both of them. First is Dr. Gillian Wallis. She is an associate professor of landscape architecture at the University of Melbourne. She's been involved in many research and written many books. To name the few as listed here is the award-winning Digital Technologies and Landscape Architecture, Reconceptualizing Design and Making in 2016, co-creative director of the International Festival of Landscape Architecture in Australia, which featured the Future Park Design Ideas Competition, which explored new open space future for Melbourne in 2019. And of course, the main agenda of today's discussion, the Big Asian Book of Landscape Architecture in 2020. And the latest is our ebook Future Park and Beyond, and part of a Yelling Book project in 2021. Next is Ibu Astrid Haryati, our panelist. She is one of our advisory boards here in Masters in Landscape Architecture ITB. She get the bachelor degree of architecture in ITB and Master of Landscape Architecture from University of Colorado. She's been involved in many association and affiliation. To name the few here, Indonesian Society of Landscape Architects, Indonesian Planning Associations, and she's also the associate of American Institute of Architects, and also licensed in American Society of Landscape Architects and International Interior Design Association. She's been involved with projects and experience in many as well. To name the few here, the Beauty Key Advisor in Public Policy and Innovative Sustainable Strategies at Green City Mayor Chicago and San Francisco, Public Policy Development, Negotiation and In Briefing International to local elected official at Southeast Asia and Northeast America and between cities in the USA, Indonesia, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. And of course, the senior special staff to the Indonesian Minister of Trade. Okay, without further ado, let's moving on to the main presentation from Dr. Gillian. Dr. Gillian, the time is yours.
Ngerti ngomong apa? Ya, harus tahu.
Okay, we're okay to see my screen?
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to talk today. In today's presentation, I'll share some insights from our recently published book on Asian landscape architecture. And it's a great honor to share this with an Indonesian audience. Over the past 2 to 3 years, Dr. Heike Rahman, who's from RMIT, also in Melbourne, and I have been working with many established designers, writers, and thinkers, as well as a new generation of academics and practitioners, to explore trends and themes that influence Asian landscape practice. Put simply, how can we think about nature, space, and urbanism with an Asian sensibility? So why did 2 Australian-based academics decide to edit such a book? As an Asian Pacific nation, Australia has a close economic and cultural relationship to Asia. This has manifested more recently in a major shift in the demographics of the country. For example, in 2017, for the first time, immigration from Asian nations outnumbered immigration from English-speaking backgrounds. Sydney and Melbourne are now considered Euro-Asian cities. These developments have seeded our interest in the Asian region, which we have explored in previous research projects and through extensive travel and professional exchange. The catalyst for this book can be traced to our experience editing a special themed edition of Landscape Architecture Australia titled Embracing the Asian Century. In this edition, we looked at issues, topics, and trends relevant to Australia's position in the region. For example, the education sector has seen a significant rise of international students from across Asia, including Indonesia. We featured student perspectives, while also reviewing outstanding design projects recognised by the inaugural IFLA Asia Pacific Landscape Architecture Awards. While we have discovered exciting new projects, we have also observed that in dominant landscape publications, an engagement with Asia is notably absent. This raises the question of who controls the landscape discourse. Non-Asian practices working in Asia seem to dominate the discourse around Asian architecture, landscape architecture, and design in the West. The Seolo project is a great example of this conundrum. The competition for this rebuilt overpass leading from Seoul Station to the heart of the business district was awarded to the Dutch architects MVRDV. Due to the employment of an international star architect, the project received huge media coverage, and in return, this generated large press exposure for MVRDV. While this itself is not an issue, it certainly has wider consequences on framing a professional discourse in different cultural contexts. For example, the project has been described as Seoul's answer to the New York High Line, leading to the validation or contextualization relative to Western knowledge. In addition, the project's best aspects were developed by local government designers and planners well before MVRD won the design competition. However, media coverage eliminates this local voice and authorship in accounts of the project. These factors eventually negate discussions that contextualize the project in the South Korean lineage of urbanization. For example, in an article published in The Guardian in 2017, Winnie Mass, the director of MVRDV, reflects on the Sky Garden ideal. The garden will be human and friendly and green in ways that might be thought typical of European city planning, but will also have a science fiction element that he sees as more Asian. In Asia, they want to dip their cities in this super green feeling that comes from science fiction, from movies like Avatar, he says, citing Singapore's spectacular gardens by the bay. Here we see clearly Mass's limited engagement with the spatial particularities of Seoul and his pan-Asian response, conflating Singapore's tropical urbanism with the temperate climate of Seoul. All of this leads to the question, what do we really know about contemporary Asian landscape architecture? From outside of the region, knowledge is sporadic, gleaned from project descriptions on websites or the rare presentation at a conference. Within Asia, there has been limited exchange that is complicated by the relative youth of the discipline, along with the fact that a collective notion of an Asian identity is new. With so many designers and academics studying and training overseas, there is a tendency to look to international Western influences for validation or inspiration over peers. As a consequence, Asian knowledge is often conceived relative to North American or European perspectives, which can cloud what is particular or unique to landscape practice. So this is the context which framed the book. We're also aware that we needed to extend our network of Asian designers and academics and hold a workshop to gain advice and inspiration for developing the book. Specifically, this workshop aimed to establish the ambitions of the publication, establish the theoretical framings and directions for academic writing, establish criteria for including design projects, and to generate content through the group discussion. In a 20-minute chance meeting with Konjen Yu in Melbourne in 2018, we declared our intention to produce this edited book, which basically challenged the Western dominant perspectives and theories, along with the desire to run a workshop in Asia. However, we did identify that we had no funding. Generously, Konjen offered to host a 2-day workshop in Beijing, although participants would need to fund their own travel. This was planned for January 2019, and we set about inviting a practitioner and academic from different Asian contexts to attend the Big Asian Book workshop. To some participants, we were unknown, so traveling to a self-funded workshop was a generous leap of faith. Unaware of it at the time, this workshop unfolded with a distinctly Asian sensibility. We offered no framing beyond a few activities that we saw as a catalyst for establishing the book's major framings, one of which was an icebreaker activity at the welcome dinner on the first night, where participants were asked to define Asia using this world map. This activity inspired endless debate and only highlighted that defining Asia is an impossibility. In preparation for the workshop, each designer or academic was invited to develop a short presentation discussing landscape architecture from their cultural perspective and to nominate 3 influential contemporary Asian projects. For us, this was an important first potential pool of projects, which we could then expand. 2 of the projects could be from their own practice. The 3rd should be nominated from the wider region. It was interesting to see that many struggled or were hesitant to nominate a 3rd project because they felt they knew so little about other practices in the region. Eventually, we had 36 projects, which we then asked participants to discuss and cluster without relying on typical classifications such as Western typologies or size. This led to exploring ideas around an Asian sensibility of space and nature, discussions of authorship, and broader philosophical concepts. The second day included the exploration of diverse terminologies and concepts related to landscape in different languages and mapping various lineages. What quickly became apparent was that these designers and academics rarely get a chance to talk to each other. Conferences are increasingly popular in Asia. However, these are avenues to present ideas rather than to discuss. The workshop also allowed us to engage with the lineage of designers, particularly in China, and see the emergence of the designer as individuals and as personalities. For example, in China, except for the prolific Congen Yu, designers are mostly hidden inside the massive design institutes tied to government. And in a surprising conclusion to the 2 days, many participants stated that before the workshop, they did not see themselves as Asian designers, but now they were proud to take on this title. We left the workshop with still no clear book structure. However, we had a far more valuable commodity: relationships. Hopping on the high-speed train back to Hong Kong, we spent the next 10 hours establishing the book's ambition and scope, fresh from our discussions and notes. We also previously had discussions about the book with then President of IFLA Asia Pacific region, Damien Tang, who's also a University of Melbourne graduate, who advised on approaching the broader politics of the region, particularly concerning China. Based on his advice, we have framed the discussions around economic zones rather than nations, which allowed us to talk about policies and without talking explicitly about politics, which, as anyone in the Asian region would understand, is quite important. After the workshop, we further developed categories for project calls that were then published in English and translated into Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and Thai. These were distributed with IFLA's help via the national chapters in the region. We received over 150 projects and 80 made it into the book. Overall, we produced this book at Asian speed, from conceptualization in 2019 to publication in late 2020. It took just under 2 years. The idea of Asia as a method provided the major conceptual framing of the book. So what do we mean by Asia as method? In a 1960 lecture, Japanese philosopher Yoshimi Takeuchi advocated breaking from binary framing such as progress and tradition, or the East and West. Agonizing over Japan's role during World War II, he argued that it was unproductive to turn to Europe or North America for explanations of why Japanese history had gone astray. While Asia's intellectual elite in the pursuit of modernization tried to emulate the West, Takeuchi reflected on the hierarchical relationship between the West and Asia, resulting from the different stages of modernization. He observed that, and I'm quoting, if one went to Europe or the United States, there would be a sense that the people there are superior to or better than oneself. Instead, he suggested the interreferencing places that share similar historical experiences to produce grounded knowledge. This idea of interreferencing, also known as Asia as method, offers a concrete intellectual agenda that enables research to be placed in its specific historical context without the epistemological and ontological burden of catching up with the West. Takeuchi argues that Asianism is not an objective concept or one that can be narrativized into a single trend of thought or innate cultural essence. Instead, he describes Asianism as a mood or an inclination. Reflecting on the Beijing workshop and the concept of Asia as method, we adopted the tripartite structure of continuum, interruption, and speed for our book. We view these as critical moods or inclinations for building a picture of what it means to design, do business, and think about nature, space, and urbanism with an Asian sensibility. There is no hierarchy to these three characteristics, which simultaneously influence an Asian practice. Hence, our readers can start with any section. Continuum establishes some of the shared cultural and philosophical understandings of space, time, and nature that cross the Asian region and explores how these are interpreted within contemporary design practice. While the discipline of landscape architecture is new in Asia, this knowledge is centuries old. Interruption explores the impact of modernity and economic growth on Asia. Urbanization shaped by complex relationships between government, developers, international and local investment, and citizens underpins the introduction of new open space typologies, along with the emergence of landscape architecture as a discipline. Speed examines how governments and designers respond to the boom and bust cycles of economic development, the imbalance of rural and urban processes, and the density of the Asian city. Rather than viewed as a hindrance, speed can be considered as a mechanism for innovation and change, acting as a catalyst for fast and slow design practice as Asian societies transition into new phases of development. Each section begins with a major positioning essay, which introduces framings and ideas emerging from Asian scholarship relevant to landscape architecture. Written by Heike and myself, these essays provide theoretical, cultural, and political contextualization for the more focused academic writing, shorter reflections, practice interviews, and design projects interwoven into each section. A major aim of the book was to merge academic writing, design projects, and critical reflection in a dynamic way that would appeal to the widest audience. We endeavoured to introduce concepts in their original language and offer detailed English translation. There obviously are too many languages in Asia to consider dual translation. And we also wanted the book's content to reach the widest audience, hence the role of English. Rather than describe the book's content in detail, I will highlight some key concepts which emerge, including 2 academic essays that relate to Indonesia. So continuum is broken into 2 sections. Artificial nature focuses on the significance of water in the Asian context, discussing its historical and cultural significance and showcasing contemporary projects. This discussion would offer the most familiar content to an international audience. Scaling up and down explores the use of deep form and cultural patterns in contemporary design work. A major feature are the 3 critical reflections from leading design practices in Korea, China, and Japan. Here we begin to see how shared cultural and philosophical ideas from who are described as the bamboo civilizations are interpreted in different urban contexts. For example, all acknowledge the importance of relationships between the mountain and water, and in their own words discuss how they adapt their rich cultural legacy in contemporary design approaches. This is particularly evident in Park Kim's essay, which discusses how to bring back the spirit of Sansu culture into the Korean city. Chinese practice Z&T reflect on how China's long history of garden making, with its many symbols and miniature landscapes, inform their contemporary practice, which also incorporates an artist studio as part of their office. While Japanese practice Earthscape highlight how philosophy and Shintoism are embedded in their precise artful practice. This is clearly demonstrated in Karasan Sui Park, which reinterprets a dry garden for motorbike parking. Bringing these three voices together demonstrates the value of interreferencing, challenging the idea of nationalistic styles to instead focus on flows of knowledge and shared concepts. This critical reflection also dismantles the reductive binary of tradition and modern, which fails to acknowledge enduring cultural knowledge. The second section, interruption, focuses on the influence of modernization, modernity, and economic prosperity in the shaping of the new discipline of landscape architecture. This section highlights the impossibility of understanding the emergence of new urban open space in Asian cities through Western typologies of public and private. It's structured in three parts. Repositioning the private realm introduces the role that developers play in constructing a new urban realm of hybrid mixed-use typologies appropriate for the dense Asian city. In many cases, developers are operating as stronger community builders than government. Ensembles highlights the emergence of new models for design which engage directly with the community and discusses how these practices reflect a transition towards more civic-orientated societies. Transformative Forces discusses how unpredictable natural disasters of earthquakes, tsunamis, typhoons, flooding, and volcanic eruption introduce powerful influences outside the control of the nation state. The essays and projects demonstrate the diversity of agents and practices involved in the production of Asian urban space. This is far more complex and dynamic than the overused generalizations such as top-down or bottom-up. This section also builds a picture of how doing business in Asia is distinctive from other global contexts. For example, the major Asian shopping mall developer, CapitaLand, redeveloped the IT-focused Funan shopping mall in Singapore into an innovative downtown hub. Mixing co-housing and co-living, entertainment, workplaces, retail and leisure, Funan offers a new interpretation of the civic. A bike path cuts right through the ground floor, while the roof features Singapore's largest urban garden. Neonbashi Garden on top of the Mitsukoshi department store introduces a peaceful contemporary stroll garden into the heart of Tokyo. A large open roof structure offers people a sheltered space to relax and enjoy the rooftop views. Similarly, Korean airline Air Busan provides a generous rooftop escape for workers at their headquarters. While in Guangzhou, the Vanke Group encouraged landscape architects Lab D&H to incorporate an extensive playscape into a commercial plaza. These four projects demonstrate the role that business and developers are playing in introducing high-quality open space into the dense Asian city. These projects clearly challenge Western ideas of public space and demonstrate why it is important to not use Western values to critique these projects. Instead, discussion needs to be grounded in political, cultural, and economic specifics. For example, academic Akiko Okabe contributes an essay which discusses how culturally problematic the term public is within the Japanese context. In his essay on Southeast Asia, Sid Sinta-Singer, who many of you might know when he's come to visit Bandung with the University of Melbourne students, argues that Asian landscape architects should decolonize their perception of informal urbanity by recognizing it as a form of indigenous modernization rather than practices to be evaded or evicted. Focusing on Thailand and Indonesia, Sid argues that urban informality is not a problem, as it is often represented in the media, but instead should be viewed as part of the creative, participative solutions that are evident in everyday practices. Shifting Scale, Yazid Ninsalam's essay discusses China's Belt and Road Initiative as an influential force on Southeast Asian urbanism, focusing on the two Chinese finance projects, Forest City in Malaysia and the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail. He highlights the motivations and potential mutual benefits between China, Malaysia, and Indonesia, along with demonstrating how this infrastructure development facilitates capital and material flows in the region. Moving back to East Asia, Jeff Howe's essay introduces the diverse ensembles of actors, including citizens, civil society groups, professionals, the private sector, universities, and government institutions in developing citizen-driven placemaking. Featured projects include the Park Up site, driven by Taipei's first co-working space, and Magic Carpet, which was a collaboration between Chinese University of Hong Kong and local communities. Other projects include insertions into the informal settlement of Treasure Hill in Taipei and the Clover Nature School collaboration program in Shanghai. Together, these discussions build a picture of an Asian urbanism where open space forms part of the complex social, economic, and political transformations which defy the reductiveness of Western landscape typologies of space. Whereas interruption focused on urban conditions, the final section, Speed, widens discussion to include the urban-rural relationship and broadens understandings of green infrastructure to heighten their intertwined social value. There are three parts. Fast Slow discusses how these two speeds of growth and decline can offer equally valuable outcomes for developing landscape practice. For example, China's declaration as an ecological civilization after decades of growth has established it as a global laboratory for ecological design. In contrast, Japan's economic slowdown and aging population has encouraged a slow ecology, which equally incorporates cultural and ecological practice. Landscapes in the Sky focuses on the integration of green infrastructure into dense urban form, with a particular focus on Singapore and its strong government policy and developer incentives. Importantly, these projects are as much about social infrastructure as ecological outcome. Retreat discusses how the desire for a retreat from the hectic, dense Asian city has produced restorative landscapes, ranging from immersive resort experiences through to forest bathing. This section, Speed, incorporates the most design projects in the book. For example, folded into Fast Slow are more rural-focused projects or installations which offer diverse experiences. The rice gardens in China are temporary design interventions that work with harvesting methods and local construction techniques to provide spaces for cultural, education, and art activities. These projects are as much about reconnecting urban populations with rural practices as empowering rural communities. The social enterprise project, Medical Herbman in Japan, travels to teach people the value and use of herbs through a planted herb garden and cafe. Yellowhorn Farm Park in Inner Mongolia celebrates the environmental rehabilitation of the Mongolian plateau. While Roof Sentiment, a temporary installation on the courtyard of Seoul's National Museum of Contemporary Art, works with the traditional hanok roof form of Korean architecture to develop a new tactile and spatial experience. Oops, we'll go back. The Landscapes in the Sky section showcases many of the extraordinary urban projects encouraged by the Singaporean government. For example, Kampong Admiralty draws on the self-sufficiency of traditional kampong villages to interweave aged housing, childcare, medical centres, outdoor recreation, green infrastructure, and urban gardens. These Singaporean projects have proved influential in the broader Southeast Asian region. For example, the extensive infrastructure projects appearing in Bangkok, such as Thammasat University Green Roof. The final section, Retreat, features landscape driven by the desire to escape the speed of the city. Examples include the Hoshinoya resorts constructed across Japan, Indonesia, and Taiwan, which aspire to reveal the hidden characteristics and cultural experience in each location. Another interesting project is the Treetop Cinema in Sabah, Borneo, which was a temporary installation as part of the Borneo Rhythms of Rimba Wildlife Festival. This project by Singaporean-based practice salad dressing constructs a cinema 26 meters high in the rainforest canopy. We conclude the book with a particularly interesting interview with salad dressing Swayan Chang, who has also worked extensively in Indonesia. He discusses how he folds philosophical explorations of time, meaning, and the natural world into his fast-paced commercial practice, located in the grandstand of a redundant Singaporean racecourse. The projects and writing featured in Speed are therefore conceived in the context of slow and fast design practice and have emerged in direct response to the processes of urbanisation discussed as part of interruption. Many of these ideas draw on cultural practices and philosophies introduced in Continuum, while others work at the edge of new technologies and materiality. Rather than viewed as a hindrance to design, Speed can be considered as a mechanism for innovation and change, acting as a catalyst for new design practices as Asian societies transition into the next phase of economic development. And I'm just going to finish with a little discussion on the graphic design of the book, which was very important to us. It was important to develop the book in a non-linear fashion so that readers could just dip into the content at any stage. This included establishing a graphic system for folding in the different essay types and projects, which range from standalone project spreads to the full integration of projects into essays. This mixing of projects and essays was a really dynamic process and continued throughout the graphic design development. We signed a contract for 288 pages without any sense of the essay length, image count, or graphic layout. Amazingly, we delivered this without needing to cut, pad, or overcrowd content. It was also important that the tripartite framing would be reflected in 3 different graphic styles. Continuum proved to be the most challenging. We were working with German graphic designers who interpreted our ambition for a Zen Muji-like design feel for this section. They kept on designing that as if it was Scandinavian minimal. And that was a very interesting discussion about the difference between Scandinavian design and white space and thinking about Zen design and white space. And lastly, a word on the title and the cover design. We never came up with a better title than our workshop name, The Big Asian Book. It just stuck. Over time, the unusual word order has made more sense. We believe this is the first book to document emerging design and theoretical directions for contemporary Asian landscape architecture. It is a book written for the next generation of Asian designers, offering much needed culturally specific theory, along with the celebration of an extraordinary body of design work, which is largely unknown to a wider English-speaking audience. This is why the emphasis is on big, as a celebration of the diversity and complexity of ideas, and Asian in recognition of this new collectiveness of Asia. We also wanted the cover to be catchy and reflect a cuteness, playful energy that can be found particularly in a younger generation of Asia. So to conclude, because of COVID, this is the first time I've presented the book to an Asian audience. We had originally planned to host many events across Asia during 2021. We wanted to see the book as just a starting point for discussions and to be able to follow up with in-person dialogue and meet many more landscape architects. Obviously, we haven't been able to do that yet, but next year, I think we should be able to travel more extensively. And we're particularly interested in Southeast Asia. Now, this is partly due to Australia's geographic position, but also because work from this region is underrepresented. For example, projects from Japan, Korea, mainland China, and Singapore dominated our project call. And this is reflective of the different stages of professional and economic development across the Asian region. In the book, we tried to offer the widest possible representation of projects, but not at the expense of merit. But in our future work, we would like to build stronger collaborations with landscape architects in Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia to bring this voice and knowledge to a wider audience. We never saw the book as a national catalogue. Instead, we hope to bring alive the cultural, economic, and ecological complexity of Asian landscape architecture, to develop ways for designers and academics to think about their work without relying on Western validation. I will end it there. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Gillian, for the insightful presentation on the books. So now we would like to hear from our panelists, Bu Astrid, the comments or rather a discussion on the topics. So over to you, Bu Astrid.
Thank you, Masep, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be a part of this presentation. When I first received the invitation, I was quite intrigued by the premise and the initiatives that were put forth, and have the opportunity to actually tap into one of the copies of the book, and was very grateful to be able to travel through the thinking process of the beginning all the way to the end, and how the book is actually put forth. And as Dr. Wallis actually presented at the latter part of presentation, it is obvious, as I also shared with Pak Budi in the early discussion of this effort, that from the lens of Asian design and culture overall, there's great degrees of differences, as Dr. Wallis mentioned, in terms of the strength and the positions of the profession. Perhaps Indonesia specifically, there are certainly room to grow. There's a lot of things that we need to actually collect and pull together. The fact that we're visibly missing in the process, it's a note to us as well. And then secondly, also the fact that the narrative driven of the landscape architecture in the region was not understood well, because I have to strongly underline that, as an example, Indonesian landscape design is less infatuated by geometry, and contemporary design tends to need to capture a lot of visualization through that exercises. So the more softer and subdued gradation of landscape design and texture was not well captured, and is not easily perhaps represented in the narrative. Was pleasantly surprised that at the very least, from the effort that was done and through the process, that the contemporary approach to the mood of the Asia as method is expressed quite well. It was great to hear from Dr. Wallis that in the process, the participant was even hesitant to propose the third project, as you mentioned, because there's, interestingly and understandingly, that we don't really know what's out there because it's not well publicized. A lot of us is just busy doing what we need to do in commercial work and other in research work, but not enough time to actually present that and disseminate. And yet, interesting also to note, in the process of this discussion with Kanjan Yu and the development of the discussion and the workshop, the energy of coming into the table with a non-conference kind of strategy actually is very Asian in approach. It's not driven by a preconceived and pre-printed statement on the part of the host, apparently, which was great. So then you were able to explore and discuss what's out there instead of to do a direct presentation, in the form of conferences, as mentioned. It bubbled up, at least in my mind so far, in reading and having the book with me, is how the invitation in the part of Dr. Wallis and the team for all of us to be on the table, for all of us to actually start not only cataloging everything, but actually step back a little bit to understand how the global north-south relationship existed. We have to accept that a lot of us are bundled and hidden behind developer, behind architects, which I started it from architecture, I can see, and then from behind of planning disciplines. And then all of us, understandably, we're confined by scope of work given to us, by the scope of the political support and funding packages that's provided to us. Our colleagues from, let's just call it more advanced position of practice, were able to create statements as through the exercise of geometry and others that can very easily understood as contemporary, quote unquote, while some of us in the Southeast Asia has to deal with more regional subdued statement, and it doesn't look contemporary, but it is for the statement of the culture. And we also need to concede and understood how in the current condition, we have to accept the existence of cultural appropriateness, and how that could help us to transfer and allow us to be a part of the discussion, at least at the beginning stage, before we can advance ourselves to be an active player for the expansion of contemporary landscape narrative. So through the lens of that Asia as method, the mood, the status, Takeuchi, the fact that we're visibly missing from this as an active participant, but grateful that we were represented by some of our colleagues and in the reading of it and the part of project in Bandung and the Rimba and others. I wanted to open the discussion to say to Dr. Wallis as well. How was the process, if I may inquire, decide on creating at least some representation of the degradation of condition? As an example, we were not able to see or discuss things that's happening in the region Halong Bay. We're not able to see certain things that's happening in Babalab in some region of the Mekong Delta. We were not able to participate in the formulation of understanding how the landscape of Banyuwangi were created through the lens of the political leader that were allowed to, bring in a new fresh breath to Indonesian landscape design. And the fact that the book doesn't have that sort of early reading of the region of Asia, wanted to understand also whether there's any opportunity to actually redefine the landscape of that through later discussion that you were hoping to host, and whether the ambition to represent this, the bigness, could help us to get away from what was stated earlier as rather, at least in my particular professional opinion, the more superficial assumption that the Asianness of things is only a green dip in a way of certain, flustering assumption of our infatuation to cuteness of things. It took us, I had to take a deep breath and step back a little bit and to say, perhaps so, we have to accept that has been the first thing and the easiest thing to pick up on from Asian sensibility, and hope that there's room to grow in the discussion to express the depth of what we are and where we came from. And thank you so much for the opportunity. There's a lot of other things that I'd like to share and be able to discuss.
So is there a particular question? Do you want me to reply to some of those comments or?
Sure, yeah, if I may, to just initiate discussion, Pak Asep, that my immediate question in form of the formulation of the book, whether there is enough materials and or interest in the part of the participant of the workshop to create a comprehensive or representative enough of the region of Asia as the landscape readings first and foremost at the beginning part of the book, before jumping into project-driven narratives that was, have a tree.
I think
preconditions presented.
There's probably two things to address there. We did go through that process of doing the project call throughout the region, and which included Indonesia and Malaysia, for example, and we got minimal interest. So that, so we did try in that first round to get the projects, which included putting it out through the professional institutes, because we knew that we were always going to be vulnerable to people going, but there's none of India, there's none of the Philippines, those type of discussions. But I think the critical thing is we never saw this as a national catalogue. It's not about nationalism. We wanted it to be about the ideas that were circulating. And also too, we were interested in projects that were post-2000 as well. So I think we have always seen this as the starting point, and also that this discussion moves away from us into Asia to be able to advance and extend this. In many ways, I think we saw this as partly Australia's responsibility in the region, and in terms of our universities, which also educate a lot of international Asian students, an extension of capacity building as well. But I think at the end of the day, we could only work with what people were giving us. And we were trying to, you can see in the way that we framed the book, we weren't trying to tick off geographies, and we weren't trying to tick off countries. We were trying to understand ideas that, and that's particularly true of the case in Southeast Asia, of the flow of ideas is very different to what's happening within, Korea, China, Japan. But I think the thing about the Southeast Asian situation, it's showing you the relative youth of the profession compared to what's happening in more of the northern regions. And that's just sort of a factor of where things are at. But it certainly doesn't mean it's no value judgment on it. It's just a case. I think that the biggest issue for the discussions in Asia at the moment is actually how to stop the Chinese landscape architects dominating the discussions, which is sort of what you see in the conferences that happen, whether it's the IFLA conferences or, the Asia Pacific region conferences. It's how do you get the diversity of voices around China, I think, is our biggest contribution is to actually try and include China, but not have it dominate in the way that it is within the professional conferences and discussion. But, as I said, the Southeast Asian work, it's emerging. And even if you look at Thailand, in how much that has changed so quickly in the last couple of years, since we started that book. But I think the critical thing that's going on here is also, it is this question about the personalities of the designers coming through. Because it's also a case of how do we know? We can't actually access designers because a lot of the time they are invisible because they are hidden behind development processes. The authorship of landscape architecture is quite often lost in a lot of the projects. And that I think is actually, our ambition it's not the encyclopedia of Asia. It's actually, to us, it's actually about trying to empower Asian designers and a new generation of students to find their own voice, and also to be able to articulate and use language and concepts which are true to where they're from, rather than going off to countries like Australia and America and being educated and and actually being educated in a way that's not relevant a lot of the time to the conditions of Asia. So that's really, the motives. But having said that, the other reason too is that there is extraordinary design work in Asia that is just not known. And again, it's this question about who has the power of English and the power of the personality, I think, is so problematic for landscape architecture in Asia. Because there is, even when we were talking to the most, big personality designers, because they're still very modest, so, and they also won't speak out, in certain situations as well. So I think, that's sort of, because obviously we were set up in a difficult position, because in some ways it was difficult, but in some ways necessary, because a lot of the people involved said that us being one step away from the region, sitting in Australia, gave us a neutrality to be able to balance things out. And I think that's really important in the discussion, is that not being part, it depends. Some people view Australia as part of Southeast Asia. Obviously, the northern regions would say Australia's got nothing to do with Asia. But I think there's two things going on there. One, that we're related but distant enough to be able to balance things, be a bit more neutral in things. But the second thing too, when we did the digital book, we also have experience in working with designers on how to get them to articulate what really is going on with design. Because I think there is a huge problem in the way landscape architecture is written about more generally, whether we're talking about Western landscape architecture or not, is that landscape architecture writes about design pretty badly in general. Like it's not, we're using a very inaccurate language. And I think that's what Heike and I are really trying to do, is to get the accuracy of what people are working with, and moving away from these really generic ideas of resilience and water and, which don't really tell you precisely what's going on. And I think too, this is sort of the thing about talking about the book. It is very much about how to widen the discussion. It's how to find the new generation of designers in other contexts, such as Indonesia and Malaysia. Because that's the other thing too, with language, it's very hard. The Asian situation is really different to when the Europeans put together their book on European landscape architecture, partly because the languages are so much more diverse in Asia than Europe. So there is there are incredible challenges on how to bring it together. But the last thing we want is the book to be read as where people flick through and go, oh, we're not represented there, because that's an impossible task, and we never set out to do that. We're really about opening up the language and the concepts, and shifting ways, offering new ways to think about landscape architecture, and also for the West to learn from Asia as well.
Very much so. It's so grateful to be able to have this piece in hand. And as you said, this is an invitation for us to actually see what comes out of such process that certainly cannot be all encompassing in the entire region. And then for all of us to also look at it, not as a reference point to say that only these condition or these projects categorically worthy of expression, but there are other things that we could actually highlights from other regions. As I shared with Pabudi before this presentation, this actually fired me up to say that we need to actually gang up among ourselves to be able to collect a better understanding of our own region before anyone else assume the role in a way. We appreciate the neutrality that's presented from yourself and colleagues to be able for us to be on the table, such as today. So this is a great positive position. And I know Padian also here representing our collective organizations to be able to perhaps follow up with a fruitful discussion afterward. If I may, just one more question, just burning in a way, less about practice, but more about the theoretical base. Currently, I'm working on my doctorate program in doctorate in design, and therefore practice-based research is really something that I acquired just perhaps time to do recently. But then therefore, through this book, I'm curious to know whether yourself, with the lens of education, were able to see an opportunity for some type of grounder theory exercises beyond that informal urbanism was actually discussed. Some of the things that water-based, ecological-based, perhaps through the lens of landscape urbanism, if we want to borrow what's used in the Western world. Is there anything actually emerging that we can call ours, in your opinion, or are we still, speaking in the more, global language?
No, I think there's definitely very particular things going on. And I think that, to me, the issue is because there are extraordinary designers, like we have met extraordinary designers, but the issue is how to get the designers to articulate what they're doing using the true cultural, economic, social context, rather than deferring to words such as landscape urbanism, landscape as infrastructure, resilience. That really, our role in the book, it hasn't been about putting the knowledge out there. It's actually been about, and particularly as it comes into English, on how to encourage the designers, because this is the thing, practice writes PR descriptions of their work. So when we did the call, I would have to rewrite it all to try and find the true interesting thing in their description, because it's all used, particularly the water ones, the water projects, you pretty much could have the same description in every country of a water project, even though they're really culturally specific, because we are so subsumed by such a generic language. So that was sort of our role, is to try and get people to not use this sloppy, bad English way of describing what they're doing, to actually go after the very careful work that's going on. And that's what I mean. It doesn't matter whether it's in English or, if you're you're a native English speaker or not. The use of language in landscape architecture is so generic that you just are missing the true knowledge. So it's there. And that's, to us, is our role as academics, is how to help designers. And particularly too, in this case, we're working with people who have English as a second language, on how to get the truly specific knowledge recorded without just deferring to that generic language. And also to maintain it as a language of design. Because if you lose the language of design, you also lose, that's where the question about the personality, the designer themselves, can also be dissolved, because that's what architecture does all the time. They are a personality, and they would tell you very clearly what they have done. And I think the nature of the landscape architect is that they take the seat back, a backward step, use very general language, don't want to claim exactly what they've done, and then also fold in Asian cultural things on top of that. And it's there, it's just hidden. And that's what I actually think. I think one of the disappointing things I see with Asian focused academics is that they're not working with designers enough. Like, you know, we're doing, all the research is actually sitting there in what the designers are doing, understanding what's happening. And I think a lot of academics are not, have very little to do with design practice. And so we're writing academic papers, but in actual fact, the designers are the ones who are, you know, who are doing stuff that we can work with. And I think that's the great opportunity.
Yeah, that's fabulous, because practice-based research could be one of the major flow of content we can acquire to be able to bridge the supposed divide between the world of academic and on-the-ground condition. And then, as you stated earlier, and how we can be brave and utilizing our own expression and acquire design language without being trapped into sort of the generic language. We do. It's exceedingly difficult, although there's a lot of eloquent speakers and writers right now in Indonesia. I've noticed that because there's quite a bit of academic-based writings right now, at least available to me. However, understandably, it still feel like a translation instead of conversion or expression. So if this is only mere translation, then ended up, mired into the generic languages. And also representative of some of the questions in the chat box about whether, suppose Western designer working on the ground versus local designer would approach things differently. Of course, there's bias, cultural, there's interest to express their personality, as you said. And things may shift when we do that. Yeah, at the same time, we are also still in the world where we needed foreign designers to actually help supposedly increase credibility in some national projects, and we have to work with that. We haven't been able to convince our international players that we are able to represent that, legitimacy and credibility. Not unlike other colleagues in different countries, perhaps, but that's real for us every day.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same in Australia. You know, they will still use international designers for big projects. I mean, but that was a recurring thing. Like the Koreans will talk a lot about that. And what they've said, we don't mind using international designers, but we do mind when they don't do their best work in our country, is what they've said, which I think is a very apt discussion. That did come through in, but at the same time, there's also this question about whether the international designers can really do business in Asia. Because, there's one thing to be hired as an international designer, but there's another thing to understand business, because it doesn't work the same way as, it would in other Western contexts. So that was a really interesting discussion with practice. And that's also where the home ground advantage was there as well, in knowing that, the procurement, documentation, all of those things are not necessarily the way that projects get run in other places in Asia. But I think the thing that we've found, and this was the interesting thing with all of those designers and academics in Beijing, and that was a pretty small group. It was like, what was extraordinary was they had never met each other before. And these were designers like in Korea and China, like they're pretty close, and Singapore. But also, like once they got talking, like it was extraordinary, like, because we were just sitting back recording it. Like we didn't, like the whole time we knew that we were we were never going to take the lead in this book. You know, that was, we knew that politically, culturally, like we couldn't. So we always positioned ourselves in trying to facilitate. And also we can write, we know how to do a book and we write in English. So we made it really clear what our roles were, and we were not the voice. But it was just remarkable when they got together and started speaking about this stuff. It was just extraordinary. And you just go, well, why don't we hear this why are conferences so boring? Why are conferences not really the place where it becomes this dynamic exchange of ideas? You know, I think that was really telling in doing that workshop. And I think too, another reason why we needed the workshop is that we needed to earn people's trust as well, because they didn't know us either. So, you know, I think what we did was incredibly brave, because we would get set up, you know, with a lot of these questions on who are you to do this type of work. But I think we knew how to facilitate this. And the other thing too is we're fundamentally interested in this extraordinary work and the personalities of these designers. I think that's sort of one of the most difficult things. Like, you have the American landscape architects. They're these huge personalities. They talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. How do we get the Japanese landscape architects, who probably have the least confident use of English? Like, the Japanese will not use English, yet they have extraordinary work sitting there. How do we get that knowledge, particularly when they've got all these ideas of the slow ecology, the aging population, like all this work, and obviously this incredible cultural background, but we can't get access to it. You know, so it's all of those questions, which I actually think it's everyone sitting in the region. There is just so much extraordinary work, but also there's so many young landscape architects being educated as well.
Sorry
Yeah,
to interrupt, Gillian and Bu Astrid. I think due to time constraint, I think we shall move to the chat box. There's a lot to discuss, and I see there's a lot of questions as well from our students and participants. So if I may, Bu Astrid and Gillian, I'll read some of the questions, and maybe Gillian can answer and Bu Astrid can add on if there's anything to add on. The first question is from Aulia. I think this also has been mentioned by Bu Astrid previously. Thank you for the delightful presentation. I would like to ask about the appropriateness of designing cultural landscape. Information can be gained easily now, so information about nations' cultural view would be fairly easy to be obtained. Do you think there would be difference if there's Western landscape designer that use Asian culture view to design space compared to if it were done by Asian landscape designer? I think some of it is been answered, but anything to add, please, Dr. Gillian, Bu Astrid?
I would just say if you haven't got the language, you can't engage with the culture. So, you know, I think that, yeah, I mean, I think that's the number one starting point, is that I don't believe that you can engage with the cultural landscape if you can't engage with language, because that's where so much of the concepts are lying, and then it's a translation, you know. So I think it would be, of course, it would be incredibly difficult.
Anything to add?
Yes, this is also an interesting view for everyone to understand how if we inquire and ask ourselves whether there is the rights of international practices to work, like what happened Martha Swartz in Thailand. She's not going to be able to to do everything because there's specific limitation on foreign designers to work in Thailand, as an example. We have to ask ourselves what happened in Indonesia. But also, at least in my professional experience, when Terra Lumen opened an office in Los Angeles, we're talking about Eastern designer coming to the Western world. We have to actually keep an eye on what is that, big personality that actually hovering the landscape of opportunity. And that is also a big lessons learned, and how the Asia as methods actually could potentially be effective in a different arena. So answering that question also, and giving confidence that while we're asking ourselves about the incoming, cultural appropriateness and who's the player working in our region, we can try to project ourselves working in a different region, and how we advance and improve and increase our ability to be effective in the design languages of the local.
Okay. I would like also to invite the participants, should you wish to ask your question directly, just use the raise hand features. Otherwise, I will just continue to read the questions. So next is from Kevin. He's one of our students as well. Thank you for the wonderful presentation about Asian landscape architecture. I would like to ask about the influence of Asia's landscape architecture for Indonesia's landscape architecture development. According to the books that has been presented, is the Asian style landscape architecture become a guidance for Indonesian landscape designer to develop landscape architecture?
I wouldn't use the word style ever. I think this is sort of a book about ideas and concepts. So we would never say that there's a style. And I think that's the thing about trying to build a theoretical base on what's going on, rather than going, that style comes from, it's like looking at Singapore. We look at that green infrastructure and identify the fact that that is so tied into particular nation building, funding, all of these things going on. So understanding the context, and that means the different economic contexts and government contexts on how things happen. So, yeah, I wouldn't look at anything as style whatsoever. Yeah, and that's why you need to read the book to understand it as ideas and theories and concepts, and not style. So, for example, one of the things that was really interesting for me is the role of the developer in Southeast Asia, and how, because government is, may not have the money to invest, that developers are working across Southeast Asia, people like Capital Land, and producing quite interesting work in a way that a developer wouldn't in Australia. So I think it's about understanding these different practices that are happening in Southeast Asia that you can understand more fully, and you're not looking at it as style.
Bu Astrid, as maybe so-called Asian landscape designer yourself, maybe any view on these topics?
I agree strongly that we should not use the book as the reference point of worthiness in the visual aspect of the project as a style, because that will captivate us and the young designer to believe that that is representative of contemporary Asian landscape architecture. As stated in the beginning, the cultural readings of Asia is quite wide. The mood is up, down, left, right, horizontal and vertical, and therefore will be very difficult, and it's to be represented by a visual style and all, or approach. Yet at the same time, as stated as well, that the role of developer in crafting the space where we can create physical manifestation of ideas is hugely important, because it's potentially pre-driven by all that, aside from public project that's generally, let's just strongly say, missing here in Indonesia.
Thank you. Next question is from Bu Roro. So maybe I would like to invite Bu Roro whether you want to ask the questions directly.
Thank you so much, Pastor, for the opportunity. Thank you, Gillian, for the insightful presentation, and Astrid for the wonderful response to the lecture. Actually, I have two questions. Actually, I have more questions, but I think I put two is enough. The first is that, Gillian, you mentioned about interreferencing method so that we have no burden to catch up with the West. But then you also mentioned that the designer that you work on, you work with, know very limited about Asian landscape projects. So it is understandable if in their design process, they're still referring to the Western project as they design precedent. So how this fact impacts the Asian sensibility that you mentioned of the designer if they're still referring to the Western project? That's the first, if you want to respond that first. Or
that's the reason why we wrote the book, is so that people would start interreferencing work in Asia rather than just looking to the West. So it's the beginning of trying to build the work, bring it together, so that so for example, when we were finishing the book last year, and I showed my students, 90% of them were Asian international students. None of them knew the work. The Chinese students didn't know the Chinese work at all. That is ridiculous that I knew more about the projects in their own country. So yeah, so that's the whole point of why we've done the book, to begin to for students, because I mean really it is a book aimed at the next generation, and also aimed, I think, pretty heavily at academics as well. That we start looking around rather than just assuming, looking to North America or Europe.
Okay, so I should continue, Pastor, for the second question. In designing with an Asian value, we witnessed that many designers refers to the indigenous or traditional value, and sometimes this is not cope with the complexity of the urban life in which the project is located. So do you have any suggestion for us as a designer so that we are not trapped in romanticizing Asia when we try to display our identity as Asian? Thank you.
I think there are many examples in the book where, and that's why we have continuum, interruption and speed. Those three characteristics are there all the time. So I think in probably all of the examples, you can be in the most dense situation, like the project is in an incredibly dense Asian city, and you still have traditional values there. I don't think they're ever gone. It's not so, and I think that's the in the way that a lot of design is discussed, particularly because of modernity and modernization and urbanism, we're framing it as, traditional, modern. We're stuck in that binary, but it's not, it's always there. There is always some sense, like a good designer can work within a highly urban, dense situation and still bring cultural values in to those projects. It's not about replicating culture as a visual, and sometimes it is. Sometimes you do have very explicit cultural references in highly urban projects. So I think it can always be there. And I think the other thing too, because remember, me doing this book is also a big exercise in discovery as well. So one of the other things that I think we hardly ever talk about in landscape architecture is the role that the various religions, which are quite often operating as philosophies, are actually guiding designers. And that's not being talked about. So when I would talk to Huiyan Chang from salad dressing, and he would talk a lot about Shintoism, actually, and he'd say, you know, he said it's I don't really worry long term, like, you know, the whole angst of where we're going, because I'm just a moment in time. You know, I'm just part of this broader flow. And that's how I conceptualize what I'm doing. So all of these designers actually, you know, some of these designers are Buddhists. And that is actually like Kochikan in Thailand, she's Buddhist. This stuff is actually informing practice. So that again is where religion is actually offering a philosophy that is actually inherently tied on how we inhabit the world, you know, how we're part of a natural world. And that's something that is not being discussed. And, you know, it's quite extraordinary when, you know, in Western theory, we talk about genus loci, sense of place, and you talk to the Asian designers, and if they have that religious philosophical practice, they don't need those framings. It's inherent in being, you know, in the culture, you know. So to me, so much of it is just, it's sitting there, but we're not actually, it's not being expressed, and it's inherently tied into what people are trying to do in their place in the world.
You are still on mute, Bu Roro.
I am sorry. I just want to confirm so that this cultural reference is not supposed to come only as a visual resemblance. No. Yes, that's, I think that's something about. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's because that's a trap for designer in Indonesia, especially. I'm an architect, not a landscape architect, but that also happened in our discipline, that copying something, you know, like a form or something, indicates, you know, that they're already like mentioning cultural value of a certain place. I think you don't recognize that as a.
Okay. And then there's the other more contemporary. So, because this is the other thing too, I think landscape architecture we sort of do culture when we do cultural landscapes, but I don't think as a discipline, we're very good about thinking about culture in a contemporary way. So there's also the way that we have a very contemporary Asian urban cultures, you know, that are very particular, you know, to whether you're in Tokyo or, you know, there's a culture is sort of positioned in so many ways. But landscape architecture, I think, is particularly bad about talking about culture. We'll talk about a cultural landscape from 200, you know, 1,000 years ago or 200 years ago, you know, but the idea that culture is all the way around us, and we're tending not to engage with it very much, I think.
Great. Okay, thank you so much for the response, Gillian. Thank you, Pastor and Astrid.
Okay, thank you. Astrid, do you have anything to add?
Oh, this is just fascinating discussion, because the anthropogenic approach to landscape architecture is missing, because it's a similar illustration like this. We're from we're archipelagic nation. We're surrounded by water. Do we go in the tourism activity and jump in the water and jump up and down and do the thing that tourists would do? No, because water is everywhere around us. We tend, and culture is embedded in us. We don't need to speak about green infrastructure sometimes, because embedded in the traditional irrigations that happen in Indonesia, as an example. But we don't use that languages because it's not readable, legible for our colleagues in a different profession. So as Dr. Wallis mentioned, the language is also a challenge for us to actually come together in one piece as multidisciplinary team. That's going to continue to be of a challenge, and our ability and interest to represent our culture with confidence, you know, not feeling second grade, if I may, you know, when on the round table to discuss it is very important.
Actually, I'll tell you a funny story about the editing of the book cover. We had, they kept on changing the Indonesian language on the cover because they kept on thinking it was a spelling mistake. So with people on, because obviously they could see the very, very different symbols of the other languages, but then when they got to the Indonesian, they kept on copy editing it out and writing it as English, which was quite amusing. But I actually think that where you see the this Asian sensibility or the mood or the inclination is actually when you start, because when you open the book, we did the whole connecting all of the different languages together around key. This is like all just says landscape architecture in different languages. But once we got inside, we were going after particular terms and concepts. And that is actually when it starts to become really interesting, like things like views and the word of landscape and all of those types of things. And I just don't understand why we haven't been, because the cultural concepts and also a lot of the management practices are actually tied into the language completely, all those terminologies. And English is terrible for landscape. It's a terrible word, landscape.
Yeah, interesting. I think I briefly had a glimpse on like architect landscape. I think that's the word from Malaysians, Malay word. Yeah.
The Malay word, and they kept on writing it in English. and we just, and they wouldn't tell us. They'd think that they were doing us a favor. And the amount of times we had to proofread that cover, not knowing all those languages, and then find that they would sneakily try and turn it into English.
Okay. Let's move on to the next questions from Zahra. Okay, maybe I invite Zahra if you want to ask the questions directly. Zahra, you still here? Okay, maybe I'll just read the questions. Thank you for the presentation. I have some questions. Densely built up city neighborhoods are characterized by lack of green spaces. The public open spaces are streets, squares, and small parks. In inner city area, as well as in urban renewal areas, the densification takes place in the form of upward extensions, with further floors being added to the existing buildings, which put more pressures on the open spaces currently provided. The question is, how can a qualitative upgrading of public and private open space be achieved? Can new types of open space be developed, and how should they be designed? How can a multiple use of open space be realized? Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
I can't really answer that question. But what I think you can do is have a look at comparable cities. So, for example, if you have a look at what the Thai designers Shma are doing in Bangkok. So, you know, you've got a city that again is not laid down with open space. They don't necessarily have a government who supports open space, and the tactics and different ways that they're trying to eke out open space in these cities. So that I think the question really, it's about like there is no, I can't name a model. You can't say how to do this. I think the best way to do it is to actually look at what's going on in other comparable development situations, such as, you know, loosely Bangkok, and see what have the other designers done. The designers, I think, are extraordinary in Asia because they're having to both do the work, they're having to mobilize, demonstrate, and then do the actual work. Like they're advocating and building the discipline. This is in Southeast Asia. Obviously, the northern part, middle part is different. But I think in Southeast Asia, there are extraordinary designers who, I mean, if you look at Kochakon in Bangkok, she has to lobby, and then she has to go in and fight for the open space, and then she has to design it and get it constructed. And they're able to achieve it. So that's what I mean about this extraordinary landscape architects at play, and they're not sitting there. And I think that's one of the things about the Southeast Asian context, is that you're having to try and eke it out, because you're not sitting in a situation like Singapore, where you've got the government with the grand master plan, and, you know, they're encouraging developers and designers and giving them incentives. So it's about strategies and tactics rather than saying, what's the model? And I think the other one is looking at the work of all the placemaking institutions that are going on as well, you know, whether it's coming from more civic institutions, or a lot of the universities are doing heaps of work there as well. There's just so many different approaches, I think.
Yep. Bu Astrid, as a practicing designer yourself and been experienced both in Indonesia and maybe some Western countries, any insight on these questions?
Yeah, it's in reality, there's only a handful of global city or not so global city can supply supposed ideal percentage of open space in its city, let alone provide proper distribution. So if we're asking ourselves whether the reference point, if the green pad, you know, the garden, the landscape, the softscape is a thing we have to seek, and without it we haven't arrived there, we should actually look at it more realistically by looking at typology open spaces, as Dr. Wallis mentioned about placemaking, because the way we hang out in public space, the way we gather with whatever systems available out there in the RT scale, in airway scale, in, you know, alleyways and others, there's a lot of opportunity to call new types of open spaces away from what Western define as, you know, the generic open space and green space. What is the definition of open space? What is the definition of green space? And what do we need in our urban communities? If we can supply that, we can activate the space, take back the street, you know, all that kind of strategies. I think we can deliver a bit more productively in this kind of, you know, jam-packed urban system.
Okay. Thank you, Gillian and Astrid. Next question from Bu Swasti. She's one of our students as well. And I think this is quite straightforward questions. Thank you, Gillian, for the presentation. I am interested with the workshop mentioned earlier. It is possible in the future time we can join the similar workshop, and about the book, how or where we can get the book. Thank you.
Okay, I think you can get the book through, is it Trolley Shop or something? I was Googling it. If you Google it, you can find it definitely in Singapore and Malaysia. And, you know, it's on Amazon and all those places. So if you just Google it, you should be able to find it pretty easily. As for the workshop, I mean, this is the thing, like we're now, I mean, lockdown in some ways did us a favor because we had nothing to do last year, which meant we could write that book really quickly, which now leaves us in this next situation on going, what do we do next? So we are thinking about, well, one, like we do want to go through these other, you know, I just want to travel and get outside of Australia, but we do want to go into Southeast Asia and have these bigger discussions without question. We are thinking of new ways. We don't particularly want to write another book because it's very, it's quite hard. It's a lot of writing, but we do want to keep having this discussion because, one, it is just so interesting, And it's just so important. It's just so important. So we will be, and I suppose too, like this is the first time we've actually talked to, apart from the people involved in our book, that we've actually talked to an Asian audience. So we've always said that we would wait to see what the reaction was to then try and work out, well, what else could we do? Like what could we do next? So this is sort of a bit of a test to sort of see what people are interested in. So if you're interested in a discussion in Indonesia, then I'm sure we'd love to do one. Or whether it's one that focuses heavily on Southeast Asia, you know, more that could be an interesting one. But, you know, we're open to discussions. I think we see our role in helping to disseminate and to be conduits to the discussion, you know.
Yeah. Hopefully the pandemic situation will be way soon and in our favor so that we can conduct offline workshop if you may. Okay, moving on to next questions from Rady. Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Gillian, for the presentation. I have a short questions about what has been explained. Knowing this book contains landscape project located in countries in Asia in general, is there any uniqueness or distinctiveness of the development of landscape architecture in Asian countries in response to the culture, environment, and needs each Asian countries have? And is there a design trend towards certain aspect of its development, aesthetic or environment?
Well, I'm never going to say that there's a trend, but what I will say is that there is an energy and a commitment. And yeah, there's a lot of innovation going on, but that's the whole thing. We never wrote that book. It's not about style. It's not about trends. And it's an incredibly diverse. There's just no way that, I mean, I suppose we're, you know, even claiming that Asia exists is quite a controversial position, you know, that a collectiveness of Asia even exists. Many people would in Asia would dispute that. So I suppose that the true intent of the book is to actually highlight the diversity of what's going on, not trying to distill it into anything that is replicable. Yeah, so you're just gonna have to go and buy the book to understand that.
Okay, so it's not to be like a recipe or guidelines for designing, I think.
No, there is no guidelines here whatsoever. It's about different ways of thinking about it, not how to do it. It's about how to extend how we think and conceptualize things.
Yeah, I think the question is also aligned with what Bu Astrid has mentioned in the earlier of the discussion about it's whether anything unique that we, our Asians, has in these matters. Okay, moving on to next questions.
There are things that are quite unique though. So things like the role of the craftsmen in building landscape. You know, there are lots of unique things, but they're not necessarily, and you know, as I've said, the way things are constructed, you're not going to get BIM happening in a lot of Asia because of the way projects are constructed and conceived and financed. Like there is lots and lots of unique things. As I said before, I wrote an essay on doing business in Asia and realizing, it's all about relationships. This is not operating in a normal, well, not normal, but in a Western litigious kind of way. There are a lot of unique things about Asia, but it's the complexity of what's going on
Okay, thank you. So to carry on, this will be, due to the time constraint, this will be our last question for the sessions. This comes from Izul. Thank you for today's session, today's class, Bu Gillian and Bu Astrid. I'm just curious that Asia landscape or parks are the oldest in the world before European landscape or park. But at this time, parks in Europe are much more attractive and more used by citizens for outdoor activities, so that the parks are more developed, more alive than parks in Asia. There are differences in activity patterns between Asia and Europe. Asia parks tend to have tighter security because they can cause problems and issues, including illegal traders, homeless people, and various other things. What do you think to improve parks in Asia, especially in Indonesia? Does a landscape architect have responsibilities in being able to solve this problem, to improve the usability of park, maybe through design, or parks in Asia need time and way to improve itself? Yeah.
Don't know. I'm gonna have to pass on that question. I don't know enough about Indonesia to comment on that. And again, parks are different in all the different contexts, I think. I mean, they are such a powerful cultural phenomena, like tied into all sorts of practices.
Okay, so over to Bu Astrid. Any insight from you?
Yeah, this is very intriguing question in ways that trying to straddle between culture and the use of open space. In some culture, us in Indonesia also don't step on the grass, right? There's sign in that way. And if we go into open space, we need to sit on benches. Do we have to? Can we sit on the ground? We don't need to have benches. Is that a supposed Western influence that we have to sit on chairs? There's a different way to gather culturally, the way we do it. And I think the task is right now, a call to action will be to, as Dr. Wallis mentioned, to look at, revisit our own culture, competence and excellence in that way, to express it in more confidence the way we should, that we have been and throughout the history anyways. But when we speak the supposed contemporary language, we should not be mired or concerned by simply locking ourselves on those kind of design languages. So yeah, like homelessness, huge in San Francisco. Open spaces, social issues is there too. So it's not necessarily unique to Indonesian challenges. It's unique to modern challenges, I think, about lack of economic supposed prosperity and access to social services and others. Still the same challenges. Flood happens in American city and parks as well. So this is all a global challenge in ways that needs to be resolved through local design languages. There's design thinking that we need to be strengthened in the part of ourselves in Indonesia. As Dr. Wallis mentioned, we need to talk to each other more. Since Pak Dian also attended here as from the association, and Pak Budi hosted this event, this is a call to act for us to connect to each other and share our notebooks, our sketchbooks, and share not only ganged up in WhatsApp groups and but also being able to disseminate thinking and ideas and put it out there. And together as a whole, we can create a mass produce and kind of crowdsource credibility and legitimacy. If we crowdsource our credibility together as a whole, we can do it. And if it's just an individual, we're going to go against the system, against a certain kind of market forces that require us to be partnering always with supposed international partners. But I think as a community of designers, we can do it if we have enough materials out there that we can be a little bit more readable and legible by others and by colleagues from Australia, as Dr. Wallis mentioned, as the neutral convener of this discussion.
Okay, thank you, Bu Astrid. I believe there's still a lot to discuss, but I think it's again the time constraint, and that will be the end of our discussion sessions. I see here there's members of our Indonesia Society of Landscape Architects. I probably would like to invite there's Pak Agus here, or Pak Dian as well. If anything to add or any insight on this discussion, if you may. Pak Agus or Pak Dian is still here? Or maybe from Pak Budi, anything to add, Pak Budi?
Okay, I just wanna say thank you very much. Oh, Pak Agus still here? You wanna say something? Pak Agus first.
Yeah, well,
My
Okay,
senior,
please,
my
Pak Agus.
senior.
Yeah.
thank you very much, Gillian and Astrid, for the discussion. I think I'm looking forward to reading the book, because I think the book would give us some ideas of how landscape design become some kind of solutions to some problems, maybe, instead of reading about guidelines of how to make good design. I think the book talks more about the problems that is faced by each of the designers and how they actually try to solve the problems through landscape design. And I think that is a very good message to send to all the readers, because I think these days we are trapped in some kind of ideas that we have to design something very grand or something very architecturally aesthetic, and we forget sometimes that we are actually solving something. And so I'm just very grateful to have met you, and will be able to read the book hopefully soon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Pak Budi?
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Agus. Thanks so much, Gillian and Astrid. I think for me and for us, all of us, it is like a wake-up call that we need to revisit our own unique culture, our roots. And I would like to respond to that call, to Gillian's call and to Astrid's call, as an academic as well as a professional. I think it is very fruitful discussion. Thank you very much for the motivations. Hopefully we can invite you directly to Bandung, Gillian, do some workshop here, as we have already with Melbourne Uni, with Melbourne School of Design. We have joint collaboration, joint workshop, collaborative studio, and so forth. Thank you very much, Pasep. Again, thanks so much. I know, Gillian, it is already late there, and in LA, of course, it's very, very late. Nuhun pisan, Bu Astrid.
Okay, maybe, yeah, thank you, Pak Budi. I see here Pak Dian as well. Anything to add, Pak Dian?
I think I don't have much to say, but thank you very much to Bu Astrid and Dr. Gillian for presenting the matter here, presenting the presentation. And I think we have so many insightful regarding our cultural landscape, our city, our environment, and hopefully we can learn more and more and find more and more about our environment. And as Pak Budi said, hopefully we can meet in a workshop here in Bandung, so we can elaborate more about this. And I hope our colleague from the Indonesian Society of Landscape Architects can get involved more and more, and in a better collaboration with the academic. I think that's all I can say, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Dian. Okay, so before we close this session, I would like to, our team has prepared some polls, so we may share some polls, and also as promised, we have souvenirs for 3 lucky winners. So maybe I over to my colleague Siva. Siva, you here?
Yes, Pak Asep, thank you very much. So can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. So hello everyone, welcome to our interactive session. So today's session is slightly different from our previous sessions. As for today, we would like to invite you to join our polling that shortly we will share the link in the chat box, or you can visit menti.com and enter the code as you can see on your screen. We really appreciate it if you could participate and you could join. You can answer the questions and also follow the instructions given to you. And don't go anywhere, because after this, we have a few souvenirs that will be given to 3 lucky participants. All right, while waiting the other participants to join us, you can press the love button on your screen to show us that you already here and show our appreciation to our speaker and also our panelists. And please wait a moment till the countdown is over and we can start together. Okay, please wait a moment. Let's give our best appreciation through the love button here. Okay, 10 seconds to go. And after this, we can start. Okay, maybe we can start. Sorry, because the time restriction. Okay, so the first, please express your emoji to our speaker today. Is it a happy face or confused or lovely or thumbs up? Okay, thank you for the feedback. Maybe, yeah, some of you give the thumb. Yeah, one of you still confused. It's okay because we learn new things today. Okay, maybe after this we can next to, yeah, second. We want to know what do you think about this coding session in 3 words. You can submit up to 3 words. How you're thinking about this coding session. Oh, interesting, cool, great, Asians. Nice. Okay. We'll see what's coming. New knowledge, insightful, provocative, fruitful. Yeah. Okay, we're still waiting for you to submit your thoughts about this coding session. Okay. So many opinions today. All right. Okay, maybe we are apologize for the time restrictions. I think we have to jump into next session in this interactive session. We'll jump directly into picker wheel. Maybe for my friends, can you just stop this? We have to jump to picker wheel, I think, because of time restriction. Oh, but you can simply choose this one answer. Okay, so let's see the result. Yeah, so many of you are ready to our next coding session. So please look forward to our social media for further information. Okay, thank you very much for your feedback. And next, maybe we can moving on. We will have speaker wheel here, and you will see the names here in your screen are arranged from the online form that we have shared before. Yeah, okay, who will be the winner? Without further ado, let's get started. Okay, maybe you can spell the name. Okay, congratulations to Sylvie for the next winner. Okay, congratulations to Anisatri. And for the last but not least, who will be the winner? Okay, congratulations to Ready. All of you can receive souvenir from us. So that's the result. Congratulations to the winners. We will contact you after the event. All right, that's all for the interactive session today. Thank you for your active participation. And once again, congratulations to the winner. And over to you, Pak Asep. Thank you.
Thank you, Siva. So that will be the end of our last session, the 7th session of KURING today. We will end this session with the group photo session. So Izul can help us with the photo, or Haikal. I would like to invite every participant to turn on their cameras so we can take the group photos.
Okay, thank you, Pak Asep. Before we begin the photo session, we hope for all the participants to turn on the camera first, because we need to capture your best smile in this last episode of KURING session. Okay, let me check it for a second. Okay, I think it is good to begin the photo session. Okay, we start the first take with a count in 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's go on to the next one in 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's go on to the last one in 1, 2, 3. Okay, I think that's all for the photo session. Thank you for all the participants. Back to Pak Asep. Thank you.
Thank you, Haikal. Okay, so that's all for today. Thanks again to Dr. Gillian Wallis, and of course to Ibu Astrid Haryati, and all to all the participants for your attention and participations. See you in the next session of KURING. Stay tuned to our social media to get the latest news on the next session. So thanks again, Gillian, Bu Astrid, Pak Budi. Signing off. See you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gillian.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good one.